Welcome to Dear Diaspora, a podcast celebrating the African diaspora and the changemakers, innovators, and entrepreneurs working to make our world a better one to live in. I'm your host, Ndulwa Kowa. Let's get started. So before I introduce the next guest, don't forget to leave a review, subscribe, and rate on Apple Podcasts. It makes a huge difference, and one key way that it does that is people are more likely to check out an episode or two if they see that there are ratings and if they see that people are actually listening to the content and enjoying the content. And one way to show that you enjoy the content is by leaving a review. So for everyone that's left a review, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And if you are listening on any other podcast listening platform, please make sure you follow the podcast so you're notified each Sunday when new episodes come out. And lastly, if you're listening on Spotify, you can actually share the podcast that you listen to on Instagram stories, just like you would a song. So if you're listening to Dear Diaspora on Spotify, you can share that in your Insta stories and I will repost. So of course, tag Dear Diaspora and I will repost, and really appreciate you spreading the word about the podcast. Happy Sunday, Dear Diaspora fam. Thank you so much for tuning in to episode 31 of the show. I am so excited to introduce my next guest. I had the pleasure of interviewing Mazuba Kapambwe for this episode. So Mazuba Kapambwe is a Zambian freelance writer whose work has appeared in Paper Magazine, OK Africa, CNN Travel, and more. And she also happens to be a podcaster. I was super excited to interview her because she is a fellow Zambian and a fellow podcaster. And so she is the host of Mwende Bwino, which was actually listed as one of the top 5 Zambian podcasts of 2020 by Nkwazi Magazine. Mazuba holds a Bachelors in Africana Studies and is currently pursuing a master's degree in the same field. During the episode, we chat more about her background, what it was like for her to move back to Zambia as an adult, the Zambian creative scene. We talk more about what it's like to travel with an African passport, how we can make Intra-African travel just more accessible, and why Zambia should be your next tourist destination. I learned so much about travel during this conversation, and I really appreciated Mazuba and just all of her insight and expertise. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Mazuba Kapambwe. Mazuba, thank you so much for being a guest on Dear Diaspora. I am so excited to have you.
Thank you for having me, first of all, and I'm really excited as well to be interviewed on a Zambian podcast. So,
absolutely, I think you're probably like my second Zambian guest, which is probably kind of sad, but yes, we'll get there for sure. So yeah, super excited to have you on the podcast and hear a bit more about your story and what you do with the Mwende Bwino. Right, Bemba.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I mean, it could be Nyanja too, you know. I mean, they say you can say the same thing, but in Nyanja, it's more like, the way they say it is a little bit different, but very similar.
Okay, perfect. So the Mwende Bwino podcast, and just a little bit more about your life and what you think about, travel and the Zambian tourism industry. So super excited to get into that. So how about we get started with just your story? Like, where did you grow up? Where are you from? I know you're from Zambia, but if you could just share a bit more about your background, that would be great.
Okay, great. So I, as you mentioned, I am from Zambia, in particular Lusaka, Zambia, which is the capital city of Zambia. But my father's from the northern part of Zambia. My mother's from the southern part of Zambia, which is where the Victoria Falls are. So I always make sure I pick that up. But my upbringing, most of my life has been in transit. So I would say travel is like the one constant thing that's been in my life. I was born in Washington, D.C. in the U.S. And when I was 4, my family moved to Bonn, Germany. And we were there for 3 years. And then when I was 7, we moved home to Lusaka, Zambia. And I went to what Americans would say middle school, which we say primary school there. And then I did my first year of high school there. No, not my first year of high school, yes. And then 7 years after that, so when I was 14, we moved to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, where I did the rest of my high school education. And 5 years after, so when I was 19, we moved to New York City in the U.S., and we were there for 5 years. So in 2012, I moved back to Lusaka, Zambia. I was 23 then, I believe. And I was in Zambia until 2018, 6 years ago now. And I've been in the U.S. for 2 years now. And I live between New York and D.C. So my parents live in D.C. and then I go to school in New York.
Oh my goodness. You've seen the world. Like, that's so awesome. Could you share a bit more about your experience going back to Zambia as an adult? You said was it 2012?
24. Yes. Well, it was definitely different so the first time I ever lived in Zambia was when I was 7 to 14, and that was a lot of cultural shock when I first got there because I had a different accent than everybody else. I cannot speak my parents' ethnic languages, so that was also a barrier. And then moving back in as an adult, I had a lot of energy when I moved to Zambia. I'm in the creative field, so the first thing that I did when I moved back to Zambia, one of the first things I did was I connected with a technology and innovation hub called Bongo Hive. And one of my friends that was based in Australia, she's the one who actually gave me that connection. And she said, just go and meet them. And, maybe they're going to introduce you to more people in the creative sector in Zambia, because previously to that, I'd been looking online and I didn't really see any one place where creatives could meet, or where there was a database of different people in the creative industry in Zambia. So I went to Bongo Hive and I met with the founder and the co-founder, and then I met other members of the team. And then from there, I started going to the events. I met Zambian bloggers, and I actually started hosting events at Bongo Hive itself. I did collaborations with Zambian fashion brand bloggers called Mafashio. And from there, we just kept doing other events. And that's how I ended up meeting a lot more people in Lusaka. So as an adult, it was definitely difficult. I started a business that I ended up closing because of different reasons. But one of the reasons was it was very difficult to convince Zambian brands and companies to invest in consultancy services for social media. And that was what the company that I had co-founded was about. And I just found it sometimes you would have to go to certain offices where there was a lot of bureaucracy involved. So that was another issue why that happened. But eventually, I think I kind of started to find my way in Zambia. I then became a full-time freelance writer, and that's what I was doing until I came back to the U.S. to do my master's.
Oh, wow. Thank you for sharing that. And so, do you think that companies today would be more open to your services per se? Do you think things have changed a little bit?
Oh, for sure. Even the last few years, between 2012 and when I left in 2018, there's been a huge difference. Companies are doing that. They're hiring outsiders, or they have people within their companies. They've created specific positions for people to be social media managers or community managers, for instance. It's definitely changed in Zambia a lot. I also just personally am not really interested in, that kind of aspect anymore, because I think, social media, it's a lot of people care about numbers and likes and things like that. And I don't know, I think that as I get older, I kind of just I'm moving away from being that active on social media. I'm only on Twitter and like Instagram now. I'm not really on Facebook anymore, but I don't foresee myself like being on these social media platforms for, much longer, or not even for the rest of my life. I don't see that being something that I'm like necessarily interested in.
Okay, that's interesting. And so while you were doing freelance work, were you among like a lot of peers that were also freelancing in Zambia? Or were you kind of like one of a few that you kind of knew were doing that?
I know that people had full-time jobs that were freelancing on the side, because that's the thing with like living in countries that are not, where the creative economy is not that developed. A lot of people that are like creatives, they do have to have other jobs, because you need to pay rent, and you need, some people have children, or, there are different needs that people have. So at the time that I was freelancing, and I still do freelance, there were not many people that were doing it like full time. And I realized like it's a privilege to do freelancing full time. Like in my case, I was living in my parents' house, so I wasn't paying rent. So that's like also like a huge thing to like think about. So I understand why there are not a lot of people who are doing full-time freelancing in Zambia or in other countries where the creative economies are not that developed yet.
Oh, wow. Thank you for sharing that. I've always just kind of wondered about that, because I feel like you see a lot of people here in the U.S. freelancing, but then even here, people complain about it not being the most steady source of income, because you just never know when the next job is coming.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, like if you're a writer, I think it's because, you spend a lot of time, like if you're a one-man operation, like for instance, like myself, I was writing my own invoices. I was pitching my articles to different magazines. So, it's like you don't spend like 100% of the time writing. Even if you're a writer, you're doing admin work as well. So especially if you can't afford to hire somebody to do that work for you. So at the end of the day, it's a lot of hours that you're putting in. And if you don't, there could be months or weeks where you don't have anyone that gives you a commission, which is like, you actually writing the article for them. Or even if you do write the article, sometimes maybe, something happens and the magazine, folds, or they are not interested in your story anymore for whatever reason. Or maybe the editor who assigned you the story gets fired. There are different, like it's very uncertain. Like you're saying, there's many reasons why a lot of people do not pursue freelancing full time. And again, there's no medical insurance also. So,
Oh, that too. Huh.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's fascinating. So I wanted to just ask a bit more about your travel experiences. Like I kind of did some research and kind of looked into your background a bit more. And I thought it was just super interesting. I saw that you were once the host of the Fest Gurus. Could you share a bit more about that?
Great. So the Fest Gurus, we called it a docu-reality web series. And so in 2013, this started on Twitter, by the way. So in 2013, I was looking through articles on different African festivals because I was bored at home. I was watching a lot of Travel Channel, and I realized that there was no one who was covering music festivals in Africa. And at the time, there was no like Black female TV host for Travel Channel. Now there's only two. There's Onika Raymond and there's Kelly Edwards, who are the two hosts on Travel Channel, the two Black female hosts on Travel Channel. And this happened in the last 2 or 3 years. So this is like, this having female-led travel shows is still not a thing that, you see on TV, especially from, minority women or underrepresented women. So I started thinking how great it would be to host a show dedicated to exploring African festivals on the continent. So I tweeted this out, and I literally just tweeted that exact thing, like, oh, how great would it be to host a show on African festivals? So there was a girl that was following me called Lorraine, and she's based in Zimbabwe, and she's a creative entrepreneur. At the time, she was a radio host for a private radio station in Zimbabwe, and she DM'd me, and she was like, you know what, there's actually a festival happening in Harare in a couple of of weeks. It's called the Harare International Festival of Arts. And she was like, yeah, like I would love to do something with you. I have these two guys who are like video guys. So, you know, we could do this. We could host the show together. And all you need to do is like come down to Harare and, you know, we can do like a pilot episode and then we can like shop it around to different networks. And I still have like the text messages. We kept the text messages between us. We still have those text messages. So at the same time that this was happening, I was working as a communications director for Bare Feet Zambia. Bare Feet is a youth and arts theater program. So they pretty much work with at-risk children, street kids, and other vulnerable children in Zambia, and they get them involved in acrobatics, for instance, and drama and theater, and they have a festival every year. So they also get booked to perform at other festivals in Africa. So they were booked to perform in Harare, and I convinced the team to like let me go with them so I could do their social media during the festival. So we all got on a bus from Zambia to Zim. I got there, I messaged her, and she came to my hotel. And then the same day that I met Lorraine in person, we started shooting immediately. We met the two guys, Gui and Zash, who became our producers, directors, filmmakers, and everything. And that started a 4 or 5 year journey of us going to different festivals. We went to Zanzibar, Nigeria, Namibia, Zimbabwe. They came to Zambia, went to Malawi as well. And we filmed this for YouTube, and this was up. It's still up on YouTube, the Fest Gurus. And we had a great time while doing this. We were doing this self-funded. So at a certain point, it became like unsustainable to continue to do it because we weren't making any money from it. And as you may know, travel in Africa is super expensive. So we were driving places, we were going on buses, but if, the rest of them had full-time jobs. So if you're trying to travel on a weekend and you're trying to fly somewhere, it's very, very expensive for you to fly to even Johannesburg from Lusaka or Harare just for a weekend.
Man.
So the show kind of, we still keep in touch and we still watch our episodes sometimes and look, and I kind of feel like we were ahead of our time because, Netflix is only investing in Africa now. And I feel like if we had done this show now in 2020 or last year, I feel like maybe we would have gotten picked up by a TV network, for instance. I just feel like we were just ahead of our time.
Wow. I mean, that's so cool. I mean, I hope maybe someone listening to this will be like, oh my gosh, let's bring it back, and sponsor
We'd love to do it.
Yeah, I feel like that's needed. I didn't, before coming across, information about the Fest Gurus, I hadn't heard of most of those festivals. I feel like I've only recently started hearing about, Afrochella and, Afro Nation, I think. But a lot of these smaller festivals, I don't think really get as much publicity. So I think it'd be really interesting for you guys to do it again. Let's put that out there.
Not into the universe.
Yes. Okay. Wow. And so how? I saw that you've also done a lot of writing for OK Africa and Paper Magazine. How do you pitch yourself to those big publications?
Okay, so with the exception of Paper, so for Paper, I didn't actually pitch to them directly. So for Paper, I had there was someone that I was working with who actually got commissioned to take pictures and do a package for Paper Magazine, and this was based off a festival that was in Coney Island in Brooklyn. I forget the name of the festival, but it's like an African festival. They bring together different African artists. Oh, it's called One Africa Fest. So I've worked with this lady before, and she's from Ghana, and she's a editor. She's been editor of several magazines. So she reached out to me. And that's how that happened. But for every other publication that I've written for that I've had to pitch, it's more of you just read what you have to literally just stay on top of what different publications that you like reading or that you're interested in pitching are putting out in terms of their content. You also have to be familiar with what's happening in the world. So that if it's February, there's going to be a lot of Valentine's content, for instance. So you have to pitch early. So like by December of the previous year, you have to be pitching articles on, if I'm a travel writer, so I would be pitching an article maybe on like the 10 most romantic places in Africa, or, the 10 most, romantic safari destinations on the continent. So different things like that are kind of aligned to what's happening in the world. And then you literally just like do a cold pitch. You send an email to the editor of the publication, and you can find the editor's email by Twitter, usually, or LinkedIn is a really good place to go. And sometimes if you really have no idea, you can actually buy the physical magazine, and you look in the first page, which is called the masthead, and it has the contact of editors there. And if that contact information is not there, like as a last resort, usually you'll find that most publications have the first and last name of the editor at whatever publication it is, and that's usually the email address. So like if you can find it, then you can try that as well, and usually it works.
Oh wow, thank you for sharing that. That's really interesting. I've always just kind of wondered how that works, but yeah, thank you for sharing that for sure. So I'd like to get to know a bit more about the Mwende Bwino podcast and just how that came about, and then we could get into more about tourism specifically, like in Zambia.
Mm-hmm. So the Mwende Bwino podcast it was an idea that came after I had been listening to the Women Who Travel podcast, and the Women Who Travel podcast is hosted by Condé Nast Traveler, by two of the female editors, Meredith Carey and Larry Orokoglu. They're the associate editors of Condé Nast Traveler. So every week they put out a different episode, and they interview women in the travel tourism space. And I, at the time, was looking for podcasts that were exactly the same, where it was a travel podcast about Africa and about traveling with an African passport, which I think is very important because Africans face unique circumstances when we're traveling versus people from other countries which have quote unquote what we call stronger passports. So if you're from an African country, most likely it's harder for you to actually get a visa to travel within the continent than it is for people from outside of Africa to get visas to travel to Africa, because, and this has to do with like countries having different relationships with other countries. So, if you're like, for instance, if I'm coming from Zambia, so if I wanted to go to a country like in the Caribbean or somewhere else, I would have to go online and see which countries allow visa-free travel for like up to 30 days or 60 days, or I would have to know like which ones require me to apply for a visa beforehand. So as an African, when you're going to, and not just African, but when you're from a country that has quote unquote a weak passport, so this could be like several Asian countries as well, it's a lot of work. Like you have to go show your bank statements, you have to prove that you have money to book a hotel, you have to prove that you're going to leave the country in a specific amount of time, you have to prove that you've got family ties back home, just in case you don't like run away there and want to marry someone from their country so that you can get a green card or whatever it is that is a form of citizenship in that country. So I kind of realized no one was addressing this thing about if you're an African, like what does it take to travel? So I decided to start the podcast, and I started in January 2019. And since then, I've interviewed a lot of amazing and interesting people from different African countries who, despite the challenges of traveling as an African with an African passport, are still traveling. So one of the most interesting, guests that I could say that I've interviewed are Joan and Dos. Joan and Dos are a Kenyan couple. They literally quit their jobs in Nairobi, Kenya, got on their motorbikes and decided to visit every continent in the world on their motorbikes. And this, since then, they've been to Antarctica, they've been to South America, and then because of Corona, actually, they've had to like suspend their trip. So they're currently in I forgot which South American country, but they are not able to leave the country because there's no flights that are coming out of the country going back to Kenya. But because of Corona, they can't travel within, like around the world anymore. So they've had to suspend their trip. But I thought they're one of the most interesting people because I think, and they're, by the way, they're parents as well.
Oh my goodness.
And I think, like because of our societies in Africa and other parts of the world where we have like very patriarchal societies and very societies that are very entrenched in like, tradition and culture, it's not very often that like you hear of people like who have like kids being like able to like just, get up and go. And I know for them it was a very difficult decision and they've spoken about it as well, but they just thought that this was something they wanted to do, they needed to do. And in the interview that I did with them, they said it's actually made the relationship stronger. So,
That's so beautiful. Wow.
It's great.
Oh my goodness. And so what can we do to make travel, like intra-African travel easier? Like, what are some steps that we can take or the governments can take to just make it more accessible for people?
Well, the African Union, which is kind of like the European Union, but for African countries, they have an agenda which is called the Agenda 2063. And this is a set of, guidelines and it's like a set of ambitions and dreams that they hope Africa will be in the year 2063. And one of these items on the agenda that they've been pushing for is the African passport. And this is literally everyone in every African country will have like the same passport. And this will allow Africans on the continent to travel visa-free to other countries on the continent. So this visa hasn't taken into effect now. So currently only certain African presidents have this African passport, and several people that work for the African Union have this passport, but citizens of the African countries do not have these passports currently. But in the meantime, while this is still being ironed out, several African countries have lifted visa restrictions on their countries. So in the last maybe the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen Ethiopia. If you're an African passport holder, you can go to Ethiopia visa free. There's some countries where now you can get a visa on arrival, which is different from like visa free, which means that you're still going to pay for a visa, but instead of you having to apply at an embassy or a high commission in your country, you can literally just fly into that country, and then at the airport you pay whatever amount the visa fee is. Mm-hmm. So these are some of the measures that have been taken to make travel easier to certain African countries. And then also there are different regional African groups. So within the African Union, there are different regions. So for instance, Southern Africa, we have what is called SADC. SADC is a grouping of different Southern African countries. So they have agreements within SADC that if you're from a Southern African country, you can go to another Southern African country and you can go there for 90 days visa free. So for instance, as a Zambian, I can go to Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, Malawi, and a few other countries in Southern Africa, and I can go to those countries and I get I think about like 90 days if I'm in South Africa that I can be in that country, without having to pay a visa fee.
That's so awesome. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So for people that for people, like, I think that's the easiest way to start traveling is instead of worrying about having to apply for visas and spending money on visas, start from the region that you come from. So West Africa, they have their SADC is called ECOWAS. Mm-hmm. So that means that a Nigerian can go to Ghana without having to, pay for a visa, for instance. So there are certain countries, and then again, Ghana is now, it's visa on arrival for all Africans as well. That's something they did about when they were doing the year of their return last year. So these are different, ways that people can afford can travel. Just look up which countries in Africa are visa free or visa on arrival, and then again, make sure you know which region your passport comes from, so that you can go to certain countries visa free.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for all of that. That's all super helpful, I'm sure, for people that have an interest in traveling across the continent. So would you say, like, from your time that you spent back home in Zambia, is it like a realistic thing for people to do? Like, I know, like, here in the US, a lot of, people our age, they are starting to make enough money to where they can start to save for trips, international trips, domestic trips, and things like that. Do you think we're at the point where people have enough disposable income to be able to travel, or are we not there yet?
I think that's a really good question. I think that whether you have disposable income or not, I think Zambia as a tourist destination for Zambians can be quite expensive, specifically when looking at national parks. So if you look at Victoria Falls, for instance, it's not that expensive if you're Zambian to get there. So if you're from Lusaka, you can either drive there or you can get on a bus. I don't know how much it costs now, but I remember the last time that I went to Victoria Falls, it wasn't super expensive on a bus to get there, and then you can stay at a backpackers. And going to Victoria Falls is probably like 10 kwacha, which is less than $1 if you're a Zambian. So some countries, including Zambia, do have special rates for tourists and special rates for Zambians. So Victoria Falls, as for Zambians, it's it has budget accommodation, it has luxurious accommodation, so it depends on your budget. But I think that's a good trip to take. That's it's affordable. But now coming to national parks is where things get a lot more expensive. So, as a Zambian, you do have to save up to go to a national park, and you do have to do your research. One of the people that I would recommend checking out, who's been to several national parks in Zambia, and she's done, the camping there, she's done the budget accommodation there, and she's done also the not so cheap accommodation. Her name is Dorothy Walker, and her Instagram handle is the Z Travel Foodie. And so she shares tips on traveling to different national parks in Zambia. And also one thing that she's said previously, and she's been a podcast guest on Mwende Bwino, is that if you're a Zambian, you have to call the company, the lodges and the camps that you want to stay at, and you have to ask them what their Zambian rate is. A lot of these places would not advertise on the website that they have a Zambian rate, but if you do call them and you say, listen, I'm Zambian and I have a Zambian passport, I have a Zambian ID, they will, most of them at least will work with you and will tell you that they do have a Zambian rate. If you're entering Zambian national parks, again, there's a specific rate that's for Zambians and a specific rate for people from other places of Zambia. So you do have to call these places in advance before you actually book the trip and, ask them what are their specials, what are their rates. And a lot of, if you want to travel to a national park in Zambia and have it be affordable, I would recommend going in what's called the Emerald season or the green season. This is the time, it's the rainy season of Zambia. So this is the time from about like November to about April. So national parks at this time, not all national parks are open, so you do have to like research which ones are open. But Kafiwe National Park, for instance, and South Luangwa National Park are open all year round. Some places of the park may be closed because of the road network. Getting there is like a little bit trickier during the rainy season, but they do have some camps that are open during that time that are closer to areas where the park is accessible. So at this time of the Emerald season, a lot of lodges and camps have cheaper rates because they're trying to attract people, because the high peak safari season in Zambia is around July to October, because that's when it's really hot. And that's when you see more animals because they're going closer to, like, they need to go to more water sources. So it's easier to see the animals together. During the rainy season, the grass, there's a lot of vegetation. The grass is very high, so it's not that easy to spot certain animals because they blend in and they're camouflage. They blend in with the vegetation around you. But it's still a good time to see some animals. You're going to see a lot of animals. They give birth during that time. Elephants and antelopes give birth during that time. So it's a good time to see new animals. And if you're into bird life, all the birds that migrate during the dry season return to Zambia during the Emerald season. So you're not going to see that much wildlife, but if you're on a budget, it's one of the best ways of going on a safari. You can always save up and then go again in the peak season. But if you go during the Emerald season, you're going to see like greenery. It's a great time to take pictures for your Instagram, and it's just a great time to get a safari experience that you're not going to have a lot of guests there, so you're going to have more attention of the staff and of the safari guides.
Oh my goodness. Wow. And for someone who, let's say, hasn't been to the continent, they haven't traveled to the continent, would you say Zambia is like a good first country to visit, or are they better off starting with a country that's more that's got like a more developed, let's say, tourism industry? Not to like knock
Well,
on Zambia at all, but
I mean, I always advocate for Zambia first, and I think it's definitely a good place for your first trip to Zambia. First of all, Zambia has the World Heritage Site, the UNESCO World Heritage Site, which is the Victoria Falls. And if you look on Instagram, like people love Victoria Falls. People love the Devil's Pool, which is part of, it's actually on this, you can only go into the Devil's Pool on the Zambian side. So I have to make that clear because Victoria Falls borders between Zambia and Zimbabwe. And a lot of people will say, oh, Zimbabwe's got the better view. But, you know, as a Zambian, and I've been to both sides, I will say that I think Zambia has the better view, and you can do the Devil's Pool in Zambia and you can do it in Zimbabwe. So so I will say Zambia. And then second of all, Zambia has 20 national parks and 34 game management areas. That's we have one of the we are one of the African countries with one of the highest largest number of national parks in Africa. We have the second largest national park in Africa, which is the Kafue National Park. Zambia is home to many species of animals that you will not see anywhere else in the world. We have the thorny-croft giraffe, which you can only see in the South Luangwa National Park. There's another like type of antelope or wildebeest that you can see in South Luangwa that you can't see anywhere else. I think it's called the blue wildebeest. That's there. And we have also the second largest mammal migration in the world, which is the bat migration. So every year, about 8 million bats migrate into Zambia from DRC Congo, and they fly to the central part of Zambia at a national park called Kasanka National Park. So for only about a month or a month and a half, this happens. So if you miss it one year, you literally have to wait for the next year to go. And it's only in Zambia where you can see this only place in Africa where you can actually see this bat migration. And then lastly, Zambia also has the second largest migration of wildebeests. So on TV, if you watch National Geographic, you usually see what's called the Great Migration, which is a movement of wildebeests. They move from one area of the Serengeti to another part of the Serengeti because of the rains and stuff. But in Zambia, we have that. It's on a smaller scale. But if you can't afford to go to a safari in Kenya, you can fly into Zambia and you can actually do the Victoria Falls, and then you can go to national park. So you get all these experiences in one go. And then again, Zambia, we're very friendly people, and English is our official language. So people who might be coming from the US or other English-speaking countries, sometimes they're intimidated to go to like Lusophone or Francophone countries because they're afraid of the language barrier. But if you come to Zambia, you're going to find people that converse, very well in English. So that's not a problem.
Thank you so much for that. And if people, let's say they're young people who are interested in, yes, visiting, the national parks and, some of the more nature-focused activities, what do you recommend they do, or where should they go to find out more about, let's say, like nightlife, restaurants, that sort of thing?
I can recommend some Instagram handles. So for like restaurant reviews, there's an Instagram called Forking Around Lusaka, but on Instagram it's Forking Around LSK. So LSK is like the slang we locals use to refer to Lusaka. So she has the girl who started the page. She's got like lots of restaurant reviews on there. So if you're looking for like somewhere to eat and you don't want to like just chance it, you can go to Forking Around LSK. Then the Z Travel Foodie that I mentioned previously, she also reviews different eating places in Zambia. And lastly, there's also the Restaurant Week Lusaka. So I think they're more active on Twitter though. But they do like the way Restaurant Week happens across the world. There's also a Restaurant Week Lusaka. So they also post different places, like all the new places. So that's where I find out about like new cafes that have opened in Zambia, in Lusaka, is through the Restaurant Week Lusaka Twitter page. So those are three accounts that you can check out for food. When it comes to like nightlife as well, different I guess brands. So in Zambia we have like a lot of alcohol brands that sponsor events, and one of the most famous events is the Jameson Connect Zambia. So they have events in Lusaka and in the Copperbelt province of Zambia as well. And then the Mosi also does events. So Mosi is like the Zambian beer. It's a version of Zambian like lager. They have events. And then the Castle Light also has different events across Zambia. And then Budweiser also has come into the market. So they have like a bunch of events in Zambia as well. There's also Zamfest, which happens, I think, around April or May. So you just have to, I guess, like look at the alcohol brands and then check like their Zambian handles and then see like what events and activities they have happening across Zambia. In terms of like an actual place that aggregates all these events happening, if you go to Nkwazi, which is a Nkwazi Magazine, they have a What's On section in their magazine, and that has like different events happening primarily in Lusaka. So those are good places to look for events.
Thank you so much for that. Wow, you're teaching me so much, and I feel like whenever I go to Zambia next, I'll just be more prepared to like really explore Lusaka, especially, and the rest of the country, because I feel like whenever I go, it's usually focused on. I'm usually just there with my family, and I have some childhood friends, and we'll go out and stuff, but I don't think I've ever really dug any deeper to be like, oh, where can I go to experience this, so I haven't seen much of the city or the country really. So definitely we'll listen back to this episode and take notes and make sure that I'm just prepared for my next trip. So really appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Yeah. And so I wanted to ask, after doing some like digging, I came across, I think me and you talked about Zambia and, our efforts to kind of revamp the tourism industry. What do you think is like one thing or two things that the Zambian tourism industry can do to kind of make travel just easier, more accessible?
First of all, I think that they need to make use of influencers and travel people and bloggers. I think that there's a group of very talented Zambian creatives who are on different social media platforms, whether it's YouTube or Instagram or whatever, and they're creating content. And I see like when I look at Zambia, like, I mean, the closest country that we usually Zambia compare ourselves to in terms of like, oh, what are these people doing and what are we doing is South Africa. And I think South Africa have a very they have a much more developed tourism campaign than like Zambia. And like they recently used a rapper called Casper Nyovest for like a campaign for their Shot Left campaign. And I think, like that's something that we could do in Zambia is if like, there are some pretty famous musicians or artists who could be used for tourism campaigns, or even just like using influencers, I think would be like a start. And then I also think that there needs to be more of like a coordinated effort to release content, because there is no like, you and I spoke about this previously, like how if you're in America, for instance, and then you want to visit another state, so it's like you want to go to Washington, D.C., usually when you go on Instagram, you just type in visit or explore, and then you write the state, visit Washington or explore Washington or visit Charleston or whatever. And what's going to come up is going to be a verified Instagram account. which when it's verified, you know that it's being run by, a tourist council or a destination management organization, which would be like a tourism agency or a visitor center, which is authorized by the state to run their tourism marketing campaigns. So we don't have that for Zambia. So even when you go on the tourism, if you were to type in Zambia tourism on Instagram, you're going to see a lot of different handles that are popping up, and you don't know which one is official because there's no blue tick, there's no verification system that's there. So that's the first thing that they need to do, is they need to get up to date and like be creating content. And it's not even just creating, because since there's so many people that already have content, it's just aggregating that content and putting it together. There is a website, there's a Zambia tourism website, which is up, but it's somewhere where you go for like just general information, but it's not necessarily updated. So you can find out about the national parks in Zambia, you can find out about different stuff, but like you won't be able to find, like the restaurant hours of a particular institution because it's not updated as constantly as it should be updated. I also think that we need to think beyond Victoria Falls. Victoria Falls is awesome, but I think that it gets the majority of like the marketing that's done about Zambia. If you look at northern Zambia, like northern Zambia has like over 20 waterfalls. They're not as big as Victoria Falls, but some of them, like the Kalambo Falls, is like, if you Google Kalambo Falls, it's beautiful. There's so many waterfalls in the northern part of Zambia. There's also a lot of hiking trails in the northern part of Zambia. There's Lake Tanganyika, which is one of the deepest lakes in the world, which is in the northern part of Zambia. And essentially, very few people make it up there. One, because of the distance of driving there from Lusaka to Tanganyika is quite far. But I feel like if you were to advertise that effectively, people would still take the journey and go all the way there because they would know that this is like a gem worth exploring. I mean, you can scuba dive in Zambia. A lot of people don't know that. You can scuba dive in Lake Tanganyika, but like it's not something that people market because it's just Victoria Falls. Like we have a lot of traditional festivals in Zambia that are not really marketed as they're marketed more as like local events that people just go to from the community. But I would fly in. Like if you've seen the Kuomboka Festival if you just Google Kuomboka Festival, like that is amazing. Like I want to go there, and I'm not even from that particular ethnic group, but it looks so amazing, and I would like plan a trip around that particular festival. So I think there needs to be like just to like go over like using more influencers, creating more content, or using more content that's readily available to promote Zambia and a focus on other tourist destinations. And lastly, there still needs to be more local prices, more local domestic tourism promoted. And I think that after the coronavirus is done, I think that it's going to force many African tourism organizations, even hopefully Zambia, to focus on domestic tourism, because people coming from outside won't be as confident to fly all the way to like Africa, because they won't be sure that like things have settled down yet. So that's the time for them to take advantage and focus on the locals.
Love it. Oh, thank you so much for that. And let's end with just getting to know more about what excites you about Zambia's future or Africa's future.
The creative sector for sure. Like I've mentioned before, I think there's a lot of creative Africans, and I think there's also a lot of Africans in the diaspora who like want to go home and want to work on like particular projects, but because there's not much of support from the powers that be in terms of investing in the creative economy, a lot of people are scared or skeptical or unsure that they do actually want to pursue creative paths on the continent or even in Zambia. But I think that people still need to be creating content. I think our time is coming. Specifically, if you look at things like Netflix, like that's an indication that African content is being valued. So if you're a screenwriter, if you're an actor, I think you should be like really, really like honing your craft right now. And also like, Afrobeats has taken over the world. So if you're producing like African inspired music, I think that you need to be like really promoting yourself right now, because the next wave, is definitely, not even the next wave, because Africa has always been, like in fashion, but like the way the West is looking at Africa, I think it's only like improving and getting better. And I think the opportunities are there. It's just a matter of like sticking through with it and just like to keep creating content so that when Netflix calls, you're ready. or whoever calls, you're ready.
Absolutely. Wow. Yeah, I really love that. And I hope to see even more creatives come out from, Zambia and just the rest of the continent. I think that will be super beautiful to see because our stories definitely are unique and deserve to be told and shared with the rest of the world. So, yeah, that's such great advice.
I agree.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Mazuba, for being a guest on Dear Diaspora. I really, really enjoyed this conversation and can't wait to share it.
Thank you, Ndu. I had such a great time. And yeah, I hope to speak with you soon and, just like keep promoting Zambia, and like shining a light on our beautiful continent.
Absolutely. So I learned so much about Zambia and the continent during that conversation. So definitely appreciate Mazuba for being on the show. Be sure to check out the Mwende Bwino podcast wherever you listen to podcasts and follow them on Instagram and Twitter. Links to their social handles are right in the show notes. So be sure to check those out, and thank you so much for tuning in. Thanks for listening to Dear Diaspora. If you like what you hear, subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes. You can find us on Instagram at Dear Diaspora or visit our website at DearDiasporaShow.com. Thank you, and talk to you next week.